And this is an extended version of the Overboard Show brought to you live from Palma de Mallorca. This morning we are joined by Captain Ian Flockhart. Good morning, Ian.
Morning.
How are you today? You good?
Yeah, fine, thank you.
You sustained an injury to your hand from
I did, a very minor one.
Well, that's a topic for another day.
Ian, last week we were talking with you about younger crew, you know, the millennials, and looking at the challenges that the younger crew have and the things they need to take note of. And we're moving to the other side of the scale today and looking at the older captains and the challenges they are facing. Now, you've written quite extensively about this recently. I think this is a very valuable point and has certainly been brought up with the older captains we've been talking to over the past couple of years. They've found it increasingly difficult, despite their experience, to find work. So can you fill us in? Because you started this discussion actually with an article a while back about aging captains and their experience.
Yes, I did. I wrote in middle of January, I wrote an article which started off because it was actually the 10-year anniversary of US Airways Flight 1549, which is, as you all probably know, was the one that was very skillfully ditched into the Hudson River. A lot of parallels, I think.
He's actually came up in the news yesterday that he's now been appointed as the head of the FAA in America. Trump has given him the job as head of the airways.
Okay, that's interesting. I missed that in the news yesterday. But yeah, I quite often draw parallels between the commercial airline industry and the kind of the upper end of the maritime industries, because I think there are a lot of similarities. So I wrote this article which opened in quite a level of detail about the events of that day and how successful it all turned out, given what the alternative result could have been. I got a very interesting reply from a reader, which I'd actually like to read out now because I think it's very relevant. It's what prompted me to write the follow-up article, which was very extensive, almost about 6,000 words. This came from someone who identified themselves to me but wants to remain anonymous. So if I can start just by reading his reply to that original article about aging captains. It reads, "I fully agree with you, Ian, and I think that experience is invaluable. What I would say is that there's probably a case of taste your own medicine within your well-written article. How many candidates do captains just disregard their CVs from? Older and experienced crew looking for jobs. It's because they don't look right. I'd like to hear your thoughts, and I remember at Mets 3 years ago, there was a talk given on the subject of aging captains struggling to find work. Whether it's right or wrong, it might be what goes around comes around. And I'll finish by saying I would much rather work for a safe, knowledgeable, grounded and experienced captain." So this, I thought, was a very interesting reply. And it's what prompted me to go on to write a very detailed article about the very subject of more experienced crew. The follow-up article kept away from captains. It was specifically about crew because I'd already said my piece about captains. So this is how we got to the stage of this follow-up article, which has been quite interestingly received as well.
Right, and so the feedback, I take it, even just looking at your responses to posting up last night on LinkedIn about this interview coming up today, you are not alone in looking at this issue, and it is an issue for more experienced captains and crew. I certainly know quite a few who, as they got older, found it increasingly difficult to find work. But you kind of have some particular pointers on why it's a struggle too.
Yeah, I mean, I've a lot of this, I've got a great personal interest in this at the moment because I've been out of work for a long time myself, which has given me a lot more time to write about these things. I think that one of the main issues, if we look, shall we say, at the younger people at the moment, and just I'll keep this bit brief, but the general level of life experience that your average young crew member has when they join yachting is very, very limited indeed. And even if they go on to become senior crew at a relatively young age, they're still going to have a very limited general life experience. Their experience will have increased, but it will only be really related to the environment that they are working in. Whereas with a lot of older crew, they quite often bring a lot of life experience to the project before they even start getting involved in the maritime industry.
Okay.
I found, excuse me, I found in especially through the radio, one of the questions that we always pose to people, because we try to get the bit of background about the person, not just about the job they're in or the company they're working for. And I think that there seems to be two streams. You've got those that come into the industry, they've gone through school, they've heard about the superyacht world, and they really see it from two perspectives. One is the kind of Hello Magazine gloss billionaire lifestyle, and possibly having a watch below decks, think, oh yes, this is champagne and jacuzzis and we'll live on a super yacht. There's the other school that comes through sailing clubs from a young age. They start in dinghies and they emerge, they kind of grow into the industry. So I don't know what the point I'm not sure the point I'm making, but do you think that makes a difference in crew, from your experience in hiring people, whether they just come from school, do the get their ticket and get it straight onto a boat versus going through sailing clubs and emerging that way?
Absolutely. I think it makes a very significant difference. My own personal circumstances, I think we touched on this last time. I was 30 before I really even got into this industry, and I was also a very experienced 30-year-old at that. I'd done an awful lot with my life at a young age, so I entered the industry with a great deal of experience, and I came from that very background that you just mentioned there. I grew up sailing on the west coast of Scotland, and it was only later, when I reached kind of my about 30, that I even realised that our industry existed as it is. To me, sailing was small boats cruising, on a sort of global basis. That's what I did. And I think that people that have come from that are considerably more grounded in many ways and will go on to make better long-term crew members than those that have come in. It seems very common now and again, we touched on this last time, the people that come in not long after school, maybe they take a gap year, they've heard all about yachting, attracted by the big salaries, etc. They go to one of these sort of accelerated learning places, and then they're in the industry very soon after that. And I'm not being critical of those types of organisations, but I think the type of crew that we get in the industry, it does come at a cost in the long run, because they are entering with almost zero life experience, and I think it's very important that people should have that in the industry.
The thing is, you opened up with talking about the similarities between airlines and airline crew and the super yacht industry, which actually resonates with me, because one of the things that I think there's an expectation, talking about airlines, there's an expectation that I've had, I suppose, since being a young lad, was air hostesses.
Or air hosts.
Well, air hosts is... I'm
sexist about it?
I don't mean to be sexist about it, but I'm going to talk from a blokey perspective. That you grow up and there was the thing of the Pan Am air hostesses or whatever. So they were always symbolic of glamour, of beauty, and there was an expectation that air hostesses were always young and very attractive ladies in lovely uniforms. And over the last 10 years or so, there's been a change in that, where you're seeing, especially with Aer Lingus, you'd see the air hostesses being a lot older. And that always gave me a moment of pause of like, oh, that's unusual, because there's the expectation of youthfulness. Bringing that into the super yacht world, I can, to a degree, understand from the owner's perspective or the hiring person's perspective that the client-facing or the owner-facing crew members, the interior crew, you perhaps would go for the more, I'm not saying this is right or wrong, the more aesthetically pleasing, shall we say, younger-looking crew members. But from senior crew, from the bridge crew, what's the driving forces there in being ageist? Because I would have thought as an owner or an owner's rep or the management company that ultimately hire the captain, that they would look more, because you're looking at a very expensive asset here. You're looking at a 50, 80, 100 million yacht. Why are they not going for the experience? Because surely that's what I'd want, managing my asset and managing my crew.
You would like to think so, and I would completely agree with you. Just to go back slightly, I covered the thing about the airline crew in the article that I wrote. Some airlines are a lot better than others in terms of the fact that they seem to very much hire experience or keep people on board for many, many years. British Airways is a very good example. So I think that is a very interesting point. You look at some of the airlines now; they have people on board, and you're like, how would they deal with things if they went very badly wrong here? But some airlines do still seem to retain the crew, and it is a full-time career for them in that they can have a lifetime job, as it were. Regarding why owners would not want to have the most competent people on board with the most experience is somewhat of a mystery to me. I know that if I fell into substantial amounts of money and was daft enough to buy a boat, I'd certainly be employing the people that could best do the job. No question about it.
Yeah, because in an emergency, as you say, these are, I'll use the term trolley dollies, which is a horrible term, but I'll use that. They're not just that. I mean, these are trained people, especially in the airlines. They're trained for, in an emergency, here's what you do, here's how you manage the passengers, here how you get them off safely. It's the same on a yacht. In an emergency, they get their tickets, they go through immense training, not just to serve drinks in the salon, but if there's an emergency, every single crew member is potentially a lifesaver.
Absolutely, yeah, I agree. If I go back to the opening story again, I actually put the link to the flight deck the voice recorder on the incident of 10 years ago. And if you just actually listen to that real recording, the way that the captain handled just how incredibly calm he was throughout what was clearly a very, very challenging situation. And I think, I put that link in deliberately because I was trying to encourage anyone that hadn't actually heard it. The people who may have seen the recent film, that I think the transcript was pretty accurate, if not exactly spot on. But to actually hear the real life recording of what happened, I think was very, very poignant. And it says an awful lot about how that person of great experience managed this very, very difficult situation. And I'm quite sure that an awful lot of people without that lifelong experience would not have handled it as well as he did. So
to counter the argument or be a devil's advocate, there was an article I talked about recently about millennials and the positive sides of millennials, because we had talked about some of the challenges with millennials with work ethic and retaining them on board. The counter argument to this in Forbes was that the younger crew are, if they like their job, if they're happy with their job, they're very good at being focused and keeping with it. But there's also an innovative flexibility with the younger people, to use the general term.
What do you mean by that?
So this is looking outside of the yachting industry, but in companies, the positives of having younger people is that they tend to be more innovative. They tend to be, they're looking for job satisfaction. They're not as happy as the generation before, who were quite happy to stick with the job, get their salary, come home at the end of the day. They may have stayed for longer, but the younger generation are wanting the perfect job. And when they get the perfect job, they stick with it. The challenge is it takes some time, as we all know, to find the perfect job. So looking at one of the possible challenges with this is that maybe older crew are less flexible or more set in their ways, which makes it more difficult to manage them or deal with them?
Just to be devil's advocate to your devil's advocacy, if I may. I remember, and you're absolutely right there, pre-late 80s, you got a job for life. And I remember coming out of school in the early 80s. And the concept was that you go to become an accountant or get a job in the real one you wanted to get was in the civil service, and it was always viewed as a job for life. And I remember in the late 80s, early 90s, I was working in corporate banking in the UK, in London, in the city, and around then you had this emergence of a new concept. And I remember there'd be whispers and people would go, oh, this is what you should do now, which was you take a job for 2 years, you get the experience, but after that, after about 2 years, then you go out and sell your CV again. And the reason being is that in doing that, you can up your salary by about 10-15% and possibly up your position in the company. And so the drive then was by having this quick rotation. It was less about long-term career progression. It was more about getting more money by flipping jobs. I'm not sure if that's, and maybe I can ask you Ian, if that's similar in the superyacht world where you're thinking, okay, I'll do a season or 2 seasons on this boat and then I'll put my CV out there, accelerate myself. And you're seeing captains now much, much younger, where before there was a long progression in your career before you got to be on the bridge, before you took the helm. But now it seems, I've met captains in their late 20s, and they're in charge of 50, 80-meter boats.
Yeah, I think something that happened years and years ago when I was doing my courses at Sash, I met I think we might have discussed this off air after last week's session. I met a guy who was no more than about 28. He was staying in the same place I was, and we were just chatting over breakfast. I asked him what he was doing, and he said he was just preparing for his Master Unlimited Orals. And I said, look, no disrespect, but how old are you? and he told me he was only 28 or something, and I was somewhat shocked. But he very quickly went on and said, no, look, don't think I'm going to have a command anytime soon. He says it'll probably take me 5 years before any company that I'm likely to work for is going to put me in command of my own vessel. And I thought that was quite an interesting concept, rather than the way that things very often happen in yachting, which again I've illustrated in some detail in some of these articles that I've written. You may have someone who has very limited experience, but just because circumstances happen to be in their favour, they end up in command of a substantial vessel with very, very limited experience, albeit they may have a piece of paper that satisfies the legal requirements. But this happens very frequently in yachting. It very seldom happens in the commercial world.
Yeah, so who's to blame for this?
I think a lot of people would like to apportion blame with the insurance companies, because insurance companies will generally just want to see that legal requirements are met, and that someone has, for example, a master, an MCA Master 500 or an MCA Master 3000 ticket, but they may have very little experience. I've been asked in a couple of occasions to actually be involved with insurers to pass on information to them in terms of who may or may not be suitable for a yacht. And basically, in my own experience, they just want to see, have they got the ticket? And especially if it's a private vessel, there's much less to consider if it's a private vessel rather than a commercial vessel. Additionally, I think there is an issue with some management companies, because especially if they're involved in brokerage as well as management, they may have something of an alternative agenda, and they perhaps are sometimes more interested in not rocking the boat with their client, and it may on occasions suit them if they have a younger, less experienced captain who's going to be more malleable and more compliant to their wishes, rather than necessarily looking after ultimately what's best for the owner's best interests of the vessel.
Is there also a financial aspect? Do younger crew or younger captains expect less or accept a smaller salary than those with experience?
I think you could generally say that, but as one of probably nothing short of an armada of older captains looking around for a job at the moment, I think right here, right now, I don't think you could say that, because there are a substantial number of well-experienced captains that are very, very keen to take on a new command. So I think the market forces are such at the moment that, if you want to save some money, you don't necessarily have to go for the guy who's just passed out of is training with a new ticket, when there are so many well-experienced captains that are currently very keen to get back on board again.
And do you think they'd accept a lower salary in order to get a position?
I know I would, because I've been out of work for a very substantial amount of time, and ultimately we all have to keep roofs over our head. Yeah, no question about it. And I'm sorry if that upsets anyone, the type of people that complain about having to drive salaries down. But when you've got very well experienced people that have been out of work for a substantial amount of time, then you can expect them to lower their own expectations, because we all need to work.
So has there been a change in the past 10 or 15 years because I think this was less of an issue a decade ago? Is it also because of, you mentioned management companies, and possibly they find the younger captains more malleable or flexible? Is there also a change because those hiring are management companies or captains hiring crew, or crew agencies, or the owners themselves? So what do you think has been the biggest change over the past decade? Or is it just because there's a lot more people coming into the industry now, trained up with their certificates, so to speak?
I think the main issue is probably the fact that there are so many captains, so many people that, as you say, have come into the industry. They've started at the bottom, they've worked their way up, they've got their qualifications, and there are simply way too many captains given the number of yachts that need captains at present. Things are a little bit uneasy economically, and it seems that people are very much sticking with their jobs at the moment. There's not a great deal of activity in the captain market, and I think we mentioned again, it was possibly off air last week, some noticeable changes in what I've noticed over the last 18 months anyway, in terms of what employers, recruiters are looking for in terms of the captain jobs that are available.
Do you think there should be some sort of tighter control giving out tickets? Theoretically,
I've been an advocate of tighter regulation since the day I got my own master's ticket, because I was shocked at how easy it was, and I've been an advocate of tighter control since then. I wrote an article which it's supposed to be published this week for the Superyacht Investor website, and I think though a lot of people may subconsciously be aware of it, they may need to read this just to remind them of the reality of the situation. So the articles, it should be out this week as far as I know. I'll send you over the link to that when it's done. But it's about the lack of any formal teaching, training or examination after someone who's following the deck route has passed their RYA Yachtmaster offshore exam, which is you can do in a 30-foot sailing yacht in the Solent, and the fact that there is no need to actually have any physical hands-on manoeuvring skills that you were examined on by the time you get your MCA Master 500 or go on to 3000. So and I checked my facts with that before I wrote it, just in case anything's changed.
Like, for example, just to use the comparison of flying, when you are flying, you have to clock up X number of flying hours before you can do your certificate, before you, coming from previously the medical profession, you have to clock up your hours as essentially an apprentice at learning the ropes from the ground up.
Yeah, no, you still have to do that. I mean, you have to obviously meet the required standards to attain your certificates in the first instance, and then you have to carry on meeting the required standards to revalidate these COCs at the 5-year period. What I'm saying is that if you're following the route to become a large yacht captain, once you have actually passed your RYA exams up to Yachtmaster Offshore, that is the last time that you are actually overseen and examined in your physical ability to handle a vessel. Okay? There's nothing above that. The MCA do not get involved in any kind of physical examination for your, ability to manoeuvre a vessel. They will ask you a question about it probably when you sit your oral exams, but there's nothing actually involved in the physical part of the thing. And this is the article that I've just written for the Super Yacht Investor site. So from that aspect of it, along with others, I've been an advocate of tighter regulation and examination for a very long time, because the simple answer to your question is yes, it is too easy in my opinion.
I just was wondering if there is looking at kind of apprenticeship, and if people have less experience, surely there are possibly more accidents happening. Now you see some really shining ones, particularly in the more commercial side every now and then. But do you know by any chance if there's any increase in accidents or bumps or bruises or whatever in the yachting industry over the past couple of years? There's a lot more yachts on the water, but proportionately, has there been any change?
I don't think there's been any dramatic increase. Yachting is actually considered by the insurers to still be a fairly low risk sector. There's a couple of things happened in the last couple of years that are going to increase premiums significantly, possibly, but not necessarily related to accidents in yachting. Fire at the Lursen yard is quite an interesting one. It's going slightly off topic here, but many would actually consider that not to be, shall we say, a marine incident, because it happened in a in a shore-based facility. But if I'm not mistaken, the fire at Lursen. But I believe, if I'm not mistaken, the underwriters are. It is being dealt with as a sort of marine casualty, and that's going to have very significant impact potentially. In terms of accidents, I'm sure pretty much everyone's listening is fairly aware with what has happened in yachting over the last few years. But I think statistically, it's still considered to be a very low risk sector. And sadly, as with these things, as they often are, it takes some tragic event before enough people will sit up and listen to try and affect change.
And it's not just captains, though, is it? I mean, you're seeing ageism throughout. I would imagine interior crew as well. Once you get to a certain age as a stewardess or a steward, you find it increasingly more difficult to get a job.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as I say, this response article was, doesn't touch on captains at all. I wrote the whole thing about the other crew members on board. I started off with a comparison of, I think I've got about 7 bullet points of what employers may seem to be the negatives of older crews. I mean, I can bring them off if that's of interest.
I think so.
To see, first off, possible concerns about how they will, older crew will fit in with a younger crew. So let's say if you've already got an established crew and you need to replace one crew member. Physical appearance clearly comes into it, particularly if it's females on the interior side. I don't think anyone's going to deny that. Possible possibly less flexible and lack of compliance, more set in their ways and not quite so likely to yield to coercion. Next one, the kind of old dogs, new tricks kind of scenario. Possibly more likely to clash with management or owners' reps. Now, obviously, looking at more senior there, maybe a chief engineer, for example, you may get somewhat more of a clash there with, if there's a management company or an owner's rep that's perhaps not as competent as you might like them to be. Possibly a bit less enthusiastic than younger crew, and possibly more likely to show up those with less experience, including critically a younger captain and or a manager. So that was the 7 main points. I'm not saying by any means that list is exhaustive, but that was just 7, principal things that I could think of that a person in the hiring food chain would think about. In terms of, why they might see the older crew member more negative. I then set about writing another bullet point list, which was considerably longer, which I considered to be the positive sides of hiring a much more experienced elder crew member.
Well, can I say we had a discussion last week on Friday, which we will be re-airing this evening, and it was looking at mental health in the industry. One of the big things that came up was the importance of leadership on board, the importance, and I actually read an article about a month ago from 3 different captains talking about this as well, is that as a captain, your role isn't just about commanding the boat, it's also being a team leader and taking on sometimes a father role, a people manager, but also taking on a paternal role, so to speak, in minding your crew, in taking care of them. And that is difficult to do at 28, to be honest. It's difficult to be a parent at 28.
Absolutely.
Let alone...
I could not agree more. I've written already about this extensively, and I've already got... a couple more articles in my folder of works that I'm currently working on, and parenting. I have certainly had to play a massive parenting role in vessels that I've worked on, and it doesn't always necessarily come from the youngest crew members on board either. Mm-hmm. Some that are certainly beyond 25 still need an awful lot of looking after because they have very little life experience, and because of the very unique characteristics of what we do in this particular part of the maritime sector. I mean, it's very different from at any other part of the maritime sector. If you work on a commercial vessel, for example, there's a whole different set of issues here that come with it, and the leadership, the parenting, the mentoring are hugely important in my opinion. And I think that any captain that can't do this, doesn't want to do it, can't find the time to do it, they are clearly in the wrong job, because it is a fundamentally important part of what a captain has to do. Now, I'm not saying that that is necessarily how it should be. If people were mentally stronger, if they were all, highly trained and highly experienced, then you probably wouldn't need to do as much of this as I found I've had to do. But a lot of it is driven by the quality or lack of quality, and the lack of specific skill set experience, and the lack of general life experience that many captains have to, I'll use the term loosely, endure on board, because they are not crewed to the level that they would perhaps like to be. So it's a hugely important part of the job. I personally take it very, very seriously. I think we've mentioned that before. I put a great deal of effort into it because it's a responsibility. It's as much part of the job as the more day-to-day, running the ship is.
Well, I think that was one of the big things that came up. We were talking with ISWAN, were part of the discussion, and they had done a survey, and it is shown that there is a lot of stress on board with crew. There is a lot of harassment, whether it's sexual or just harassment. Over half of females reported to feeling harassment on board. And this is having a big effect on mental health. And we also had a Captain William Gould, who was talking, and he said, I was lucky enough 20 years ago in my training that I was given some training on helping people management and noticing signs of people undergoing stress or anxiety or, going on to depression. But it is, I think, a huge part of the job, and something that doesn't necessarily happen in your early training. You get your certificates, but there isn't, I know that there is a course, health and well-being management, but it's not a requirement. It's something you can do extra. So I think that side of it and the leadership side of it is a huge part of why experience plays a big part.
It is, and it is very much. And if you're only 28 years old, with all due respect, you cannot have a tremendous amount of experience in that field, and it's very, very important. 16, 17, 18 years ago, I came across a vessel. She was about, I'm going to say, between 45 to 50 meters, a sailing vessel, and she had a very young captain on board. And while they were pottering around in coastal waters, none of the other crew seemed that concerned about it. They then had to go off on, a kind of at least halfway around the world trip, and several of the crew just jumped ship because they just did not have any confidence in the captain. The captain, there was 4 or 5 crew on board the vessel that were older than the captain, because though they felt he was competent enough in a much closer to safe haven things over on the long term, when you're literally so far offshore, you've got nobody really to come and help you. And in most cases that will be the case. And I mean, just to balance this argument a bit, look, I'm not saying that it's always the case that an older crew member or captain specifically is better, but let's not confuse age and experience with crass stupidity. I only need to mention 2, or in fact even one word, and you'll know what I'm talking about. If we say the word Costa, and we're not talking coffee, everybody knows what comes next. At the time that incident happened, that guy's approximately the age I am now, but I've studied it in detail, and it was.
This is the guy who went right up close so he could wave hello to his wife and kid. There you go.
Yeah. I mean, this is
funny enough. I was thinking of our friend Costas, and I'm like, what? What has he to do with it? Not you, Costas.
So I'm not. To balance the argument here, I'm not saying that it's always the case, but that's why I said let's not confuse age and experience with absolute stupidity.
Well, the one thing you do learn in this industry is planning for that eventuality, that extreme, and there's a lot of training goes on in teaching you things that you hopefully will never ever have to execute in that scenario where lives are in your hands. You're on the open waters, and an extreme situation occurs that you've got to react to and take command and be convincing as a commander in saving lives.
So much of that stuff that is going to be so critically important to you should any such situation arise, I believe a great deal of it is going to come from your general life experience and not just your experience in a specific given role.
Yeah,
I think having anyone who's read any of my stuff in any detail, a phrase that I use frequently is having a wide and deep level of knowledge over a multitude of subject matters. Not just knowing how to navigate a ship, how to do this on a ship, how to do that on the ship, but having an extensive skill set and an extensive knowledge base, which doesn't happen overnight. And this is why I think general lifetime experience in other industries can be vitally important in running a successful ship, because what happens with a lot of the younger crew that have come not long.
Sorry, we seem to have a pause at the moment.
Little pause in our connection.
So please stay tuned. We are going to be right back with you in a few minutes. We're just going to move to some music.
From Palma de Mallorca to the global super yacht community, Super Yacht Radio.
And that's the beauty of live radio.
Apologies for the interruption.
Yes.
But picking back up the conversation, back to you, Ian. You were about to say something before we got rudely interrupted.
Yeah, what I was about to say there, if you have a crew member who has come directly into yachting not long after school, even as they progress a little bit, they become more experienced, they become more skilled in their specific skills, they are accruing more general life experience. But if that's all they've ever done, they can still have a relatively blinkered view, and it doesn't lead to being particularly open-minded about things. So with a lot of people that have had considerable life experience before they get into yachting, or that have, again, accrued more life experience whilst they've been in yachting, but have come from other life experiences, you tend to have people that have just got this greater, broader, deeper experience, which I think is very valuable, because it's much more conducive to sort of looking at things from a different perspective, thinking outside the box sometimes a bit more. It's not so blinkered.
Yeah, no, I agree. Actually, I'll bring in one of my life experiences, and not wishing to sound like I'm making light of the situation, but our third daughter, when she was being born, she came very quickly. She didn't mess around, and when she was born, it was a little bit of a difficult birth.
Dave was the midwife, as it turned out.
I was the midwife. We were up the side of a mountain where we lived, and I had to deliver the child very quickly. But when she was born, she hadn't started breathing, and this doesn't make light of it, but in that situation, Maeve was a doctor. I've read many medical stuff. I've seen medical things, but
typed up a lot of my projects.
But in that emergency situation, the first thing that came to mind was a Walt Disney cartoon of 101 Dalmatians, and there was a scene in it where he's bringing one of the puppies back to life, as it were. My point is this, that in an emergency situation, you don't just go back to what you've learned in books or schooling. You pull on every different life situation, everything you've learned in that path, no matter how abstract and how ridiculous it might seem. But you don't have time to do a Google search on stuff. You have to pull from what's in your head and what you've been exposed to. As crazy as it might seem, that was what came into my mind at that moment. Was there's a situation that I saw, this is how it was dealt with,
and stay calm.
And I'll stay calm and apply that. And thankfully, it worked, and everything worked out beautifully, and we've now got a lovely daughter who moves a lot slower. But it's crucial.
I'm a great believer that, as I say, this vast range of lifetime experience is so important. I've got my list of points that, positives for the older crew members. It's just bullet point stuff here. If you'd like me to rattle through them, just to give an idea. So generally, this is the one at the top, generally have vast and very, very importantly, varied experience. Generally, little or nothing to prove. Generally, less attitude, more likely to know and appreciate that they're onto a good thing, much more stable in their roles, less likely to jump ship, can be excellent teachers and mentors, much more respect for chain of command, probably more disciplined in general, and generally take less, if any, training day-to-day tasks, much less likely to complain about things, much more happy to be at sea for extended periods of time, probably less likely to have a conniption fit if the internet goes down for more than 3 minutes.
Probably happy if it does.
much less reliant on technology in all forms, more inclined to fix as opposed to replace, better house trained and less likely to cause damage, less troublesome in many senses, generally more consistent and reliable. More skills and old school practices and techniques than younger crew. Less likelihood of issues with other crew on board in terms of interpersonal relationships. Probably more safety conscious, usually better administrators, much more secure in their own perception of their own role, generally more emotionally intelligent, to a greater life experience, more used to doing what more needs to be done. generally need to spend a lot less time on them than you do on their younger counterparts. Much greater understanding of obligations, duty, responsibility and accountability, and less likely to bring drama with them on board. So that was, it was just 27 points there that I, just sat down and looked at my own experiences as what, could be some positive aspects of having older, more experienced crew over their younger counterparts.
There's 2 points which maybe I missed them, but 2 points there that I don't think you hit on, which to me are pretty important. One is the older, more experienced captain has a much wider field of contacts within the industry.
Yeah.
And so when, especially in destination ports, so when something needs to be done, they often can call on people that the younger crew members have yet to meet. And sure. If you have guests or owners on board or just about to arrive, I think that could be crucial. And the other thing, which I don't know if it was in your list there, the older captain as an educator.
Yeah, that was in as mentor. Remember, this was the follow-up article where I wasn't dealing with captains at all. This was specifically crew members. But no, I did, in the list there was very much the mentoring, teaching supportive role.
Because that's important from both perspectives, but especially for younger crew to learn the tricks from the more experienced ones, I think is, that's something that you don't want to lose in the industry.
So, Ian, if I was a younger captain listening to this show, what would be your kind of mentoring couple tips of
save your money, you might need it.
There's that. What would be, or even younger crew, what would be your big focuses? You're starting out, you're still quite young in your career. You've got the looks, you've got the personality, you've got your certificates. But bear this in mind. These are the things that you would really emphasize to bear in mind.
I think a lot of emphasis away from your maritime skills. You've got to pay a lot more attention to learning how to be a good leader and manager. Over-managing people, micromanaging people is as bad, if not worse, than not managing them at all. You've got to learn the management skills. You've got to learn the business skills. You've got to really focus on all the non-maritime stuff. Presumably the MCA already believe that you're good enough at that, otherwise they wouldn't have given you a ticket. That in itself could be debatable, but that aside, focus on the people skills, the business skills, the management skills. These are the crucially important ones, and try as best you can to improve your own life experience outside of yachting as well, because it's going to give you a broader perspective to look at things. It can be very easy to become extremely blinkered working on a boat, I think.
Can I ask a question?
That would be. Yeah, go ahead.
Can I ask a question? We talk about the crew members, the interior crew, the deckhands, the captains. I'm wondering, when it comes to the engineers, do you see the same kind of ageism with the engineering side? Or do they actually go for experience? I pointed this out in the article. I kind of separated things in the article. There are those that I imagine are much more susceptible to the bias, and engineers are ones that can, it's less likely to affect them. They're locked away in their little spaces a lot of the time. Nobody gets to see them, and perhaps even the owners that prefer having a lot of eye candy around them. They don't care about the engineer, and maybe they are at the back of their minds. Well, I want my ship to run, from a mechanical, electrical perspective as safely as possible. So they probably don't care, because the engineers are not that often seen in the the front line of the public eye on board. Also, chefs maybe can get away with it a little bit more as well. Chefs as well.
But then I mentioned this specifically in the follow-up article that I wrote. So it doesn't affect everybody. To the same extent, I shouldn't imagine, but it's certainly the people that are more, shall we say, frontline, customer facing.
I do actually know
more of an issue.
I know personally a crew member who actually was dismissed and was told the reason for his dismissal wasn't the quality of his work, but he was aesthetically displeasing to the owner's wife.
Well, I hope he took that up with someone to help him with that.
I think at the time it happened, you just took it and you got another job.
This happens a lot in the industry. I mean, we all know people get dismissed in ways that are clearly unlawful, and there seems to be a tremendous amount of ignorance around it. I know it's different. It's complex, different flag states, what state your employment contract's in, etc. But there does seem to be a general perception that you can just be fired in yachting and that's the end of it.
Yeah, but that's the thing, that there is a perception that you'll be blackballed if you complain, if you try to go to the Nautilus or one of the authorities, that you will not get another job. And it's funny, we had a talk on with Tim Cook about mental health.
Tim Clark.
Tim Clark. About mental health in the industry. And I raised the point with him that perhaps a lot of crew aren't speaking up about their mental problem because they're afraid if they take time that they need to get that sorted out, that when they come back looking for a job, they get blackballed. And Tim's reaction was, no, not at all. That's a fallacy. However, he did come back and say if he knew the captain well and he was doing a reference, if he heard that there had been a mental health issue, he would be less likely to put that person forward, A, because it would be unfair to the boat, and B, because he felt it might be unfair to the crew member. So...
Or that maybe they weren't... and it was a valid point, but, if you're suffering from mental problems, that maybe this is not the best industry for you.
I would agree with you. It's if you have your own mental health issues and you're aware of them, then that is unfortunate, and I have empathy for you. But perhaps for your own well-being, you would be better placing yourself in an environment that's not so difficult, challenging, and when you can be a long way from help, and you're probably doing yourself a big favour by finding a position that might be more conducive to your own state of mental health.
Well, we're about 2 minutes to the top of the hour. Final thoughts on the subject.
Final thoughts on the subject. If I'm ever unfortunate enough to be in an aircraft that suffers a major technical failure, I want the next Chesley B. Sullenberger sitting in the left-hand seat. No ifs, no buts, no maybes.
And do you think the organisations that like MCA, etc., should tighten up the giving of these tickets, that they should perhaps look at a broader spectrum, not just your seat time, but maybe looking at captains having more experience? Is there a way to police that?
I don't think there is, because the MCA's remit is clear. They're concerned about the just safety and also environmental issues now. So much of the critically important other stuff is now and always will be outside the remit of the MCA, and that's why it's so lacking, because there is no one to make sure that it has to exist or that it should exist on board. There's no one to police it, and it should be down to the owners, the managers, the recruiters, to make sure that the people they're hiring have got all these other skills and not just the bits of paper that the MCA say that they ought to have.
Absolutely agree with you.
Super.
Well,
thank you.
Very valuable stuff there.
So much for your time, as always, Ian.
You're welcome.
Font of experience and knowledge. We will be sharing up on LinkedIn your article so that people can read a little bit more about what we were discussing today. I need to read the article.
I'm very unprepared. Sorry about that.
That was Ian Flockhart, experienced captain, part-time Superyacht journalist. Thank you so much for your time today.
And available for another position.
And we'll talk to you again soon.
Very much so.
Ian,
thank you.
As always, thank you again. Really appreciate your time. It's Ian Flockhart, Captain Ian Flockhart. You're listening to Superyacht Radio. Time for the news.